Library in Paris. I'm Charlie Trueheart. I'm the director here, and we're all very honored to be one of the venues in Paris for the Festival des Ecrivains du Monde, which, as you probably know if you're here, is a co-production of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and Columbia University's Europe Global Center, which many of us know as Reed Hall. We're especially proud that the festival is sharing with the library and its members such a distinguished author, Gary Shteyngart. Welcome, Gary. I'm personally very grateful to Carol Llewellyn and Jill Brack and Emily Seftel, who brought us Gary and helped us to organize this program. On your left, the library's own Grant Rosenberg will be interviewing our guest in a few moments. I'd like to thank you all for being here and for your contributions at the door, to thank you in advance, as the case may be, for your donations at the refreshment table after the program. These gifts are essential to the life of the library, which receives no funds from any government, but instead counts on gifts large and small every year from people just like you. They help to support a rich calendar of programming, most of it around books throughout the year. If you're new to us and would like to know more about all that goes on here, including about becoming a member of the library, please speak to me or to Grant Rosenberg or Abigail Altman, who he's talking to, or any of our volunteers who are here tonight. I'll just say a few words about upcoming programs since I have you here. I'll just name four. Next Tuesday, the prize-winning science writer Sean Carroll will be here from Washington to talk about his twin biography of Albert Camus and Jacques Monod, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in their fields. His book is called Brave Genius. And the next night, Wednesday night next week, the novelist Naomi Wood will be here from London to talk about her novel, Mrs. Hemingway, which is a fictional recreation of the stories behind the four women that he married and left one way or another. Following week, first week of October, we present two kind of Frenchy nights. On Tuesday, the 6th, food writer Susan Loomis will be here, and on Wednesday the 7th, travel writer David Downey, both popular local sages of the French way of life. You can watch eLibris for listings of other events to come throughout the fall. I want to thank Shakespeare & Company for being with us again tonight to make copies available of Gary Shteyngart's books. I'd ask you to silence your phones now as I give the microphone to Emily Seftel, who will introduce our guest, Emily from the festival.
Good evening. My name is Emily Seftel from Columbia Global Centers Europe, and on behalf of Columbia University and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, I am very happy to welcome you to the third edition of the Festival des Ecrivains du Monde. We are honored to welcome such an incredible lineup of writers this year who join us from 15 countries. I would like to thank all of our sponsors, donors, supporters, and partners. Without your generous help and support, none of this would be possible. We are indebted to Charles Trueheart, Grant Rosenberg, and all of our friends here at the American Library in Paris for making us welcome in their beautiful space. Heartfelt thanks also to all the festival staff and volunteers. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Gary Shteyngart, who will be in conversation this evening with Grant Rosenberg, Programs Manager at the American Library in Paris. Gary Shteyngart is a professor at Columbia University's School of the Arts and the author of several acclaimed novels. Super Sad True Love Story, which won the Bollinger Everyman Wodehouse Prize and was selected as one of the best books of the year by more than 40 news, journals, and magazines around the world. Absurdistan, which was chosen as one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times Book Review and Time magazine, and The Russian Debutante's Handbook, winner of the Stephen Crane Award for the First Fiction and the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Travel and Leisure, Esquire, GQ, the New York Times Magazine, and many other publications. It has been translated into 26 languages, and his hilarious and inventive new book, Little Failure, a Memoir, has been named one of the best books of the year by more than 45 publications. I'll turn this over now to Grant Rosenberg and Gary Shteyngart. Enjoy the evening and enjoy the festival.
Hi everyone, great to be here in Paris. Thanks for coming out on a Friday night when you could all be eating some delicious animal somewhere. Yesterday I ate a grouse. I didn't even know grouse still existed, but there it was on my plate. And I ate it, and it was delicious. And the waitress actually patted me on the head. She was so impressed. I ate the whole bird. It's great to be here, and this is a very nice festival. And I'll just read a little bit before Grant picks it up from my latest book, Little Failure, which was my mother's nickname for me growing up. Still is. It's an interesting, well, I would say it's a book, you know. The best part of this book, as critics have unanimously said, are the photographs inside. Specifically this one on the cover. I don't know if you can see it, but it's this is 1974, and in the Leningrad, they had this thing where they would put a child in a photo studio, and with the latest in Soviet technology, so like a fork, you know, or something like that. And I got this car instead, and this scared the crap out of me. I couldn't drive for 42 years, 2 years ago. And then the book is about moving to America, and what happened was that in 1979, not everyone knows this, but in 79, Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev reached a deal. The Soviet Union had a lack of, some bad harvests, as it always does. And desperately needed grain to function. And America apparently needed more Jews to function. So millions of tons of Midwestern wheat were exchanged for about 50,000 Jews, of which I was one. I don't know who got the better deal, frankly, because I was worth about 2 baguettes and a croissant, I think. So we emigrated to America, and I was a huge lover of Lenin. There was a big statue of Lenin outside of our window, and I'd always hug his pedestal every morning when I wasn't dying from asthma. But then I came to America, and I had to learn English, and the part I'll read to you is about trying to learn English. And I also had to learn Hebrew, because I was sentenced to 8 years of Hebrew school for a crime I did not commit. But 1980, when we came, was a difficult time to be a Russian in America. You guys may remember Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech and all those movies, Red Dawn, Red Gerbil, Red Hamster, everything was red. And I had to pretend to the kids in Hebrew school that I was actually born in East Berlin, not in Leningrad. You know things are bad when you have to convince Jewish kids that you're actually a German. There it was. I have readings in Germany next week, and I wonder how I'm going to say that. And we were really poor. I had, one shirt and one pair of pants, and a bunch of T-shirts that the parents of the local kids had donated. And my toys were a pen and a Chewbacca action figure that was missing half of his paw. And from Russia, I had this fur coat and a fur hat made out of some woodland animal. And the teachers would actually take me aside and say, look, you need to get rid of your fur. Kids will play with you more if you're furless, which is true in adulthood as well. I found out. So I was a loser. I was the red gerbil, and I was the second most hated boy in Hebrew school. But something changed when I decided to become a writer. And I wrote my first novel. And there it is. My parents thankfully kept a copy of it. This is called Invasion from Outer Space. Hundreds of pages of little boy scrawl. Let's take a look at the first chapter. Chapter 1, Something is Wrong. We didn't know how to say child welfare services in Russian, so this is as close to a plea for help as I could produce. But then when I was about 11 years old, a really momentous thing happened. A substitute teacher came to relieve the moronic inferno of Hebrew school, and her name was Miss S. And she was this wonderful, wonderful woman. And I'll read you a section from the book about how she helped to make me the whatever that you see before you today. On one of her first days on the job, Miss S asked us all to bring in our favorite items in the world and to explain why they make us who we are. I bring in my latest toy, a dysfunctional Apollo rocket whose capsule pops off with the press of a lever, but only under certain atmospheric conditions, and explain that I have even written my own novel. This passes largely unremarked as the latest batch of Star Wars X-Wing fighters and My Little Ponies are paraded around. Finally, Miss S holds up a sneaker and explains that her favorite activity in the world is jogging. "P.U.!" a boy cries out, pointing at the sneaker and holding his nose, and everyone except me laughs their wicked child laugh. I am shocked. Here is a young, kind, beautiful teacher, and the children are intimating that her feet smell. Only me and my 200-pound Leningrad fur coat are allowed to smell around here. I look to Miss S, so worried that she's going to cry, but instead she laughs and goes on about how running makes her feel good. After we have all finished explaining who we are, Miss S calls me over to her desk. "You really wrote a novel?" she asks. "Yes," I say in my Russian accent. "It is called The Challenge." "May I read it?" "Yes, you may read it. I will brink it." And brink it I do, with the worried admonition, "Please don't lose it, Mrs. S, okay? And then it happens. At the end of the English period, when a book about a mouse who has learned how to fly in an airplane has been thoroughly dissected, Miss S announces, "And now Gary will read from his novel." His what? Oh, but it doesn't matter because I'm standing there holding my composition notebook straight from the Square Deal Notebook people of Dayton, Ohio, zip code 45463. And looking out at me are the boys beneath their little flying saucer yarmulkes and the girls with their sweet aromatic bangs, their blouses studded with stars. And there's Miss S, who I'm already terribly in love with, but who I've recently learned has a fiancé, not sure what that means, can't be good. But whose bright American face is not just encouraging me, but priding me on. Am I scared? No, I'm eager to begin my new life. Introduction, I read. The mysterious race. Before the age of dinosaurs, there was human life on Earth. They look just like man of today, but they were a lot more intelligent than man of today. Slowly, Miss S says. Read slowly, Gary. Let us enjoy the words. I breathe that in. Miss S wants to enjoy my words. So I continue slowly. They built all kinds of spaceships and other wonders, but at that time the Earth circled the moon because the moon was bigger than the Earth. One day a gigantic comet came and blew up the moon to the size it is today. As I'm reading it, despite the many errors, I'm hearing a different language come out of my mouth. I do full justice to the misspellings, the Earth circled the moon, and the Russian accent is still thick. But I'm speaking in what is more or less comprehensible English. And as I'm speaking, along with my strange new English voice, I'm also hearing something entirely foreign to the squealing and shouting that constitutes the background noise of Hebrew school. Silence! The children are silent. They are listening to my every word. And they will listen to the story for the next 5 weeks as well, because Miss S will designate the end of every English period as Gary Novel Time. And they will shout out throughout the English period, "Where would Gary read already?" The school is close to Long Island. So. And I will sit there in my chair, oblivious to all but Miss S.'s smile, excused from following the discussion of the mouse who learned how to fly in an airplane, so that I may go over the words I will soon read to my adoring audience. And God bless these kids for giving me a chance. May their God bless them, everyone. Thank you.
As long as we're talking about Little Failure, I wanted to ask how you worked on it. I know you revisited places and people from your past. Were there unexpected discoveries and revelations?
Well, yes, quite a few. I decided that if I'm going to write a memoir, so much of my fiction is basically autobiography. I have absolutely no imagination. But I thought, okay, I'm going to do a memoir. Let's do this right. Let's research the hell out of it to make sure that at least it's as honest as possible. Everything was a revelation. I would meet friends from all parts of my life and learn new things. I took my family back to the Soviet Union, which was, well, sorry, it's called Russia today, but it's, the Putin Union, you can call it. Yeah, everything was a surprise. I was walking past the largest mental hospital in Leningrad, and my father said, "Oh, I spent part of my 20s here." I was like, I didn't know that. It was an interesting tidbit that can be useful for my memoir. So it was really a kind of a true journey of discovery, to use the cliche. And I'm glad I did it. And I never want to do it again, because it was also very painful.
So, okay, bear with me with this question. Now, you're a novelist who has, as you said, borrowed and expanded, or borrowed directly from your own life, and most of your writing is very autobiographical. And we read in your novels things like corporal punishment, preteen circumcision, and now
a bumper sticker that says, "Ask me about my preteen circumcision."
And now we, perhaps as we read those novels, if we read them before Little Failure, we thought, okay, this is fictional. And now we see how those are interlaced and how you use them. Do you think you approached writing a memoir differently than you would have had you not used so much in your fiction?
It was tough because, well, actually, one of the reasons I wanted to write this novel, this memoir, was I wanted to sort of get rid of all the stuff on my shelves. Because I thought, oh my God, I've written 3 books, they deal so heavily with autobiographical material. If I have a real fire sale and get rid of everything, there'll be nothing more left to use. And then I can start writing about other people, instead of the usual narcissistic mode of the memoirist. And I did. I think there's nothing you wouldn't know about me after reading this book. It's absolutely shocking. Yeah. The circumcisions are just the beginning. It gets worse. But in terms of the approach, I would wake up every day, and depending on where I would be in the novel, in the memoir, I would say, okay, so I'm 9 years old now, what's life like for me? Who are my enemies? Who are my friends? Who's hitting me more, my dad or the kids in school? Stuff like that. And then I would try to spend hours, I write a lot in the countryside, 2 hours north of New York. And I would just take these long walks, a lot of it was in the summer and the fall, and try to spend 3 or 4 hours remembering everything I could, and then I would try to translate it to the page.
Last night we had a panel on the 60th anniversary of Lolita, which is a book written by a man, a Russian, who came to the United States later in his life. And perhaps because of that distance he had, he was able to really capture what America is. Do you feel that, can you riff on being someone who is from 2 cultures and living in the United States and trying to capture what Americana is?
Well, actually moving upstate for half the year and learning how to sort of drive a car, not too successfully, as many lawsuits will attest to, but fairly well, is my first real encounter with America. Like, I drove to a mall, and I bought a baby carriage in a mall. These are things that many Americans do, but if you live in Manhattan all your life, it doesn't really happen. You take a taxi or somebody delivers it. So I've been really learning much more about America by leaving, by crossing the Hudson, or actually going north from the Hudson. Actually, I'm along the Hudson. That whole analogy doesn't work. But I don't know. Nabokov is one of my favorite writers. Stylistically, I think he has no peers. I teach him at Columbia. I teach 2 classes. One is called Immigrants a Go-Go, and I teach Pnin there, one of my favorite of his books, Pnin. And then I have a class called The Hysterical Male, which is all about dead white people we shouldn't be reading anymore. But I teach Pale Fire there, and the students love that book. He's absolutely fascinating in the sense that, yes, he's an immigrant, but he grew up in one of the wealthiest families in all of Russia. Some say possibly the wealthiest family at the time. And so he had a French governess and an English governess. And so when he showed up to America, he wasn't exactly, and so he couldn't speak a word of English. He was actually incredibly erudite, far more so than most Americans. So when you read him, you have to realize that this is a man who's trilingual almost from birth, and that actually colors the way you think about it. But he was an immigrant in many other ways, and Pnin is my favorite book. If you haven't read it, please do. It's only 193 pages. Utter hilarity, but at the same time, one of the smartest books written about many subjects. There's a chapter in there about the Holocaust that is one of the most elegant and brilliantly written chapters on that subject I've ever read. It's just sandwiched in there in the middle of what seems to be a book of great comedy. And it's one of my favorite books about immigrants, too. So Nabokov rocks.
When we first announced that we were doing this, and I contacted you, you said, or on Twitter, you said, you had me at Rosenberg. And which I took to mean that perhaps my reputation preceded me.
Yes.
Probably not. But your persona, as you alluded to before, and what you write about is very much one of being a Jewish writer. And there's a long tradition of particularly American Jewish writers. What does it mean to you to be Jewish?
So it's one of many identities. I'm the big immigrant. At these festivals, I'm always on some panel with 7 other immigrants, and we're always like, we're the immigrants, here we go. Let's start our own rock band. I think in America, people think of me as a Russian, even though I came at age 7. In Russia, I'm definitely an American, because I smile, and that's not something Russians do. Like, look at that idiot. I'm like, hi. And as a Jew, in Russia, I'm definitely a Jew. I was once walking by the Dostoevsky Museum, and there were two drunks literally in the gutter, and one of them said, "Hey, look at that Jew!" I said, "Hi, guys." Keep walking. But I'm not a practicing Jew, but I'm, the way most Jews are in New York, culturally Jewish. But living in a coastal city in America, everyone's sort of Jewish. I have Korean friends who use Yiddishisms all the time. Hey, give me a schmear. Really? You just came from Seoul 4 years ago. Really asking for a schmear. Unbelievable. So I feel like Jewish culture and American culture are now almost completely merged together into a Steinfeldian thing.
Well, part of the reason I ask this is because there are certain writers, and maybe Philip Roth, who don't really want to have that label necessarily, and they kind of put it off. But you seem to be embracing it in spades.
Yeah, Philip Roth said, "I want to be known as an American writer." But Philip Roth also came of age when people still read books. So you could actually say, "Yeah, I'm going to be this kind of writer. You call me an American writer." Nowadays, you're like, "Please buy my book. I'm a Jewish writer. I'm a Vietnamese writer. Whatever you want me to be, just buy the damn book." So things have changed in that respect.
So you, as I mentioned that we had interacted on Twitter, you use social media, there's a few writers I think who use it so often, Joyce Carol Oates, Colson Whitehead, to name a couple.
Yeah.
How do you cultivate a relationship with readers that way, and how do you find that balance? Do you have time to have dedicated long hours to write, or are you constantly tempted to be interacting online?
It's bad. It's destroyed a lot of my writing life and my life in general. It's so hard, because it is addictive. A writer basically wants somebody's appreciation and love. And you can spend years writing a book, or you can tweet a picture of your dachshund and get the same result, basically. So I've been tweeting pictures of my dachshund ad nauseam. It is very destructive. I don't know what it does, except for give you that bit of gratification. I'm not sure it actually sells books, although publishers claim otherwise. I don't know what the good part of it is. Well, one of the good things is that when I do go around the world, I can draw a nice crowd, usually by saying, "Hey, come and bring your dachshund, I'll pet him," etc., or her, and stuff like that. It does work for that, but I don't know beyond that what it does. But it can be fun. Now some writers are switching to Instagram. Michael Chabon's on Instagram. He's great. I love putting a heart next to his pictures, and he hearts my pictures, and that's the state of literature today, basically.
Are you also interacting with readers that way and responding? Certainly outside of festivals and appearances, 20 years ago, people didn't have that same relationship with the people they read, and now they can send you pictures of their dachshund.
Yeah, but I'm like a serial liker, so if people post stuff, I just like everything they say, or so I don't discriminate, unless it's some kind of white supremacist movement tweet. I will cover it. But again, I don't know. Where is this all leading? I know writers who are on this thing day and night, and their output is 30% of what it was before all this stuff happened. It used to be upstate, because America is a country with bad technology, that there was no cellular service where I was. And that's a huge portion of this book was written at that point, where I would go upstate and actually not be able to tweet or do anything. But then they fixed it, and so now everything sucks again.
Well, you kind of, in Super Sad True Love Story, you kind of seem to be preaching about this, about people always on their mobile devices and so focused on themselves, and that was already written several years ago.
Yeah.
I assume that part of it is almost self-criticism, that you, from what you're saying now, that you were critical of how much you were spending time on that.
When I started writing Super Sad True Love Story, which is set in a dystopian future where nobody lives their lives, everyone's just in a virtual reality, it was just starting. It was 2006 or something, and I didn't know anything about any of these communications. So I had this intern who was people say he was the most attractive intern they've ever seen. He was this tall, beautiful man. They called him the Man-turn. And they're even making a movie about him now. Yeah, they're desperate. But the Man-turn helped me, introduce me. I had a AOL account, which I thought was way too high speed for me, and he introduced me to the world of Yahoo Mail, which is, and the beginnings of social media. So he helped me develop a persona and stuff. But at first I had no idea what I was doing. But I realized immediately that this was going to be the end of a lot of things, including personal interactions, the kind of introspection that we used to have. I remember being in a taxi in New York and just like my panting dachshund leaning out the window and sort of looking at all the architecture and the people and everything. And that's how a writer develops. You're constantly looking at things, examining who's sitting here, who's saying what, who has a mustache of which width or girth. But now I'm in a cab and I'm doing this, and the world is just floating by. All these wonderful things that could be turned into words no longer are, because I'm tweeting some stupid thing about the baguette I just had, or a salmon I just enjoyed, and it's worrisome, but it's very hard to break that addiction. There's a program some writers use. I think Zadie Smith may use it, or is it Franzen? It's called Freedom, and what it does is, maybe Franzen, it knocks you off the internet if you're on it for too long. That's all it is, yeah. I think it costs like $4,000, but it stops the internet and reminds you to go back to work. So that's money well spent. It's a tax deduction for sure.
And then you pay another $4,000 to please turn it back.
You pay $8,000 because they know you're a junkie.
Another thing that I've been wanting to ask you for a while now is actually, you have a reputation as a blurb hound.
That's a nice way to say it. There's other ways.
Yes, I know. Family event.
Yes.
But tell us about the politics of blurbing and what that means and how it works in the publishing industry.
For me, blurbing is a performance art piece that I do, because I literally, for the longest time, blurbed every single book that was sent to me. My criteria was the book has to have 2 covers, a spine, and an ISBN number, and that's it. I would blurb it. And each blurb would become, so a blurb is the thing you see in the back that says, So what I wanted to do was I sort of wanted to raise the arms race of blurbing, so my blurbs became ridiculous. Suck it, Proust, this book about whatever is much better than anything you wrote. Sort of like Tolstoy meets Shopaholic meets Manhattan, or whatever, takes Manhattan, that kind of stuff. And so I became so somebody made a documentary about my blurbing. It became kind of a thing. But then it got really ridiculous, because, environmentally speaking, I'd go home and trees would be, the doorman had to shovel this crap into my apartment, So I published a piece, I think it was in the New Yorker somewhere, where I said that I'll only blurb Ukrainians now, because I feel so bad about what's happening there. So if you're Ukrainian, please, and you have a book, I'm your guy. Not since Gogol has blah, blah, blah.
You did say that you write autobiographically, but are you tempted, or are you already writing, the life of a 19th century French handmaiden, or is that something that doesn't interest you?
No, history is so far behind us, jeez. No, I'm kidding. Love history. History. No, but writing this memoir, like I said, has freed me up. So my new book has nothing to do with small, furry immigrant Jews. It's my first. Small, free, immigrant Jew, free. And the heroine is an attractive woman in her early 30s who works for this mysterious hedge fund and goes around the world destroying places. It's set in 10 different cities, and it's nothing like nothing I've ever written before, which may be terrible, but it's exciting to not write with my voice,
And did you feel that this was the time to do that, or was it a story that compelled you, or did you actually say, I need to break from what I've been doing?
Well, I'm somebody who's very reactive to the environment in which I live, so I've lived in Manhattan for the longest time. And a lot of my novels are about people in Manhattan. My first book, The Russian Debutante's Handjob, whatever the hell it was set, the first third of it was set in Manhattan. And I really loved New York at that point, but these days, New York, I started to notice one thing about New York, about Manhattan specifically. None of my friends live there anymore. I'm surrounded by people who work in finance. So I started talking to these people, and I became friends with some of them. Some of them are very nice. I know you're shocked, but it's true. They're adorable. And some of them are readers, although many of them are very strange readers who misinterpret what I write. So for example, there's a book club on the Virgin Islands of these tax exiles, and they think supersat is this credo against, liberalism or Obama and stuff like that. I don't know how they got that, but it supports their insane views. So there's that. But I wanted to write about the way the world, I'm always curious about the way the world works, and in some ways Little Failure is a bit of a departure, because Supersat was about technology, Absurdistan was about foreign policy and oil politics in the former Soviet Union, and the book I'm writing now is about finance. So I actually do write not just about myself, but about actual topics. But this really took care of the need to Because I thought it was an interesting story. It's the story of sort of these two giant superpowers, one of which collapsed, the other of which isn't doing so hot. Every superpower I go to kind of self-destructs, right? Whenever I go to China, they're like, okay, get out.
I did read in Little Failure that you write in bed. Is that true? Is that how you? What is your?
This posture doesn't just come from nothing. This is me. Yeah, I write in bed.
So it's working out.
It's working out great. Yeah.
Are you writing longhand or on a computer?
On a computer. Yeah.
And why do you prefer a bed to a desk or standing?
I don't even, I never read standing because I always fall over. It's hard to keep me standing. Even sitting is hard. Like, I wish I could be in bed right now. That would be great. I think for my next appearance, I would like a raised dais with a bed on top. Wouldn't that be amazing? I could just answer your questions. You could see my feet. I think they're small and pretty.
We do have some couches back there.
Oh, that would be lovely. That would be a good start. Yeah, so I'm part of the Oblomov part of literature, where I'm always supine and...
You're kind of jumping around.
I really feel like lying down now.
This will give you some big space. So all of your books use humor, even when you're exploring difficult things. I mean, even Little Failure, you talk about being a very heavy drinker and some very dark things. But you use humor, perhaps to deflect from some of that. How do you see the role of humor in literature? Do you think it's well represented, or that it's looked down in some way? The way in cinema, you have comedies that don't quite get the respect of serious films.
Yeah, no, for sure. What's called literary fiction has very little room for the kind of stuff I do. It's different in Britain, actually. Britain, people I think take this a lot more seriously. In fact, I won one of the best awards I've ever won was the Wodehouse Prize, which is, speaking of alcoholism, a Jeroboam of champagne and an actual pig, which I ate immediately, and the family of the pig. I was just voraciously hungry. Wait, humor. Oh, yeah. So humor, the importance of humor for me, and this is, you were talking about Russian heritage and Jewish heritage. I mean, that basically, the humor is the beginning of that. And I think of it, and let's go back to Cold War terms, as this sort of, humor is this, intercontinental ballistic missile, but tragedy is the payload. So what you're trying to get across is actually quite tragic, but I'm here to, I think that if a book doesn't entertain the reader on some level, you really haven't done your job, and that goes against the grain of what literary fiction is supposed to be and how actually we do teach it sometimes. And the MFA level, but I still think that books should be interesting and entertaining. But a book that's also just one joke after another, but missing the tragedy also doesn't do the trick for me either. The thing I loved most about my parents was that they were very funny. They were, they had their problems, but they were incredibly funny people, and the humor was always very political. I remember one of the first jokes I ever heard was in 1980. During the Moscow Olympics, and Brezhnev was supposed to give the opening speech at the Olympics. And the joke went something like this. So he was already completely senile at this point. He could barely talk. He died, I think, the next year. So he climbs up to the podium, and somebody gives him a piece of paper, and he's supposed to read the speech, and he goes, so he starts reading, and he says, oh, And this goes on for a while, and somebody runs up to him and says, Comrade General Secretary, those are just the Olympic rings. So that was one of the first jokes I ever heard, and it's a really good joke. It's a nice joke because it's also very performative. So when I write, I try to think of ways to get that kind of humor across.
And how are you perceived in Russia? How do your books do?
Terrible. Possibly the worst sales of any country, including Belgium. Right? Belgium sells more than Russia. Let's see. Some of the reviews have included Balding Traitor Betrays Motherland. That's a good review, actually. Shteyngart Pleases His CIA Masters was another one. But this year I wasn't allowed back. I was getting on a plane in New York at Kennedy, and they said, no, your visa's wrong and you can't go. So there goes that. So I'm going to Kiev in 2 weeks. No one country, Ukraine will have me still.
And were you were you involved with the translations of those books into Russian?
Yeah, I did. I had my first book was this very much older lady who was very prim, and every time she encountered any curse word, she would just put the first letter of it and then ... So my job was filling in the ...
What is it? I want to talk about this a little bit, because this was the voice that you read, your interior voice, how you would have written that book in Russian as your first language.
Yeah, well, so the beauty of having another language, as Nabokov can certainly attest to, Conrad, anyone, is that even if you're writing in English, and English is my primary language, I'm not going to pretend that Russian is, but Russian is a kind of secondary soundtrack, and when I write, I can listen to both soundtracks. It's this kind of stereophonic sound. I also dream a lot in Russian. All my nightmares are in Russian. I speak to my parents in Russian, which is similar. So yes, it's good. It's good to have another language. I really encourage people to speak it or to write it.
I'm sure there's some questions out there. If anyone would like to ask one, go ahead.
Well, Hebrew, I really don't know any Hebrew. I mean, 8 years of Hebrew school means I don't know any Hebrew. That's what the school's designed to do, to not teach you any Hebrew. But Russian, for sure, it's a much funnier language, I think. It's built for humor in a way, and a lot of the humor is using, for example, diminutives. So my mother didn't call me little failure. She took the English word failure and she added a diminutive to it, so she called me failurechka. Isn't that cute? It's a nicer and it's funnier because the chka sound is funny. In general, Russian has, I think, a greater bandwidth for humor. I don't know if this theory exists, but the harder life in a country, the funnier its language? No, that's not a PhD thesis that's useful. Is that possible? Yeah. I mean, life in Denmark is great, and funny. So yes, if anyone wants to steal this for a dissertation, I would contribute to it. Oh, so I was the second most hated. A guy named Jonah Himmelstein, that's what I call him in the book. That's not his real name. The legal department at Random House made me switch it out, and I can't say it because there's a camera going. But yes, he was incredible. He was worse than me. I didn't know I had untied shoelaces, but he had actually stuff sticking out of his pants, and he was a real nebbish. But every day I said, thank you, God, for making a nebbish worse than me, so that I could deflect some of that nebbishness. And the first question was?
Does having two languages make you funnier?
I think so. I think the more you can sort of, when you have more than one language, you're constantly referencing another language, and you're melding them together like failurechka. I think most of the bilingual people I know are very funny. Immigrants are very funny people in general, even though their lives are awful, but boy, they're funny. Right, so basically, and there was interesting, you mentioned that there's an article in Psychology Today that talks about how people who are bilingual have a different sense of the country in which they live in, and I guess, maybe I'm not paraphrasing correctly, but there's almost a different kind of sense of both empathy and outsiderness of that.
We probably read the same.
I was, yeah. So I think that's true. I think there's a reason why Nabokov, Conrad, and now writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, Junot Diaz, why so many writers that do come from a different perspective do so well, especially in American literature, because they do have that outsider perspective. Look, I mean, it's only recently, and I think really since I learned how to drive and can, park and learn how to park, that I do feel American to the core. But before that, I would always look at things with almost the same perspective as my parents, who saw Americans as these sort of rich, frivolous people. And they would say that in Russian. They would say, "Они от жира бесятся," which is so untranslatable, but it means basically they're wild with their own fat. Isn't that great? It sounds funny, right? So try to translate that into a book, and you already have something. But it was always this perspective that we could never be Americans. That's crazy.
But did it influence how you saw? I mean, do you think it gives better perspective for a young child to have that way of getting outside of their experience?
The question is, does it help when you're a kid, when you're a young child trying to get into that experience? I would say the opposite. It was so my parents made a very fateful decision, which was that we would speak Russian in the house and not English. And two things happened there. One is they never learned English well, because one of the primary ways you learn English or any language is through the child coming home from school, blah, 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 in the language. But the other thing that happened is that I retained Russian, which many kids who come at age 7 do not, a sophisticated version of Russian. But all I wanted to do was get the hell out of that Russian household and become as American as possible. At that point, I did not appreciate what my parents were doing, in the sense that they would keep this culture alive. All I wanted was to get rid of anything Russian, remotely Russian, and to become as American as possible. So we had one record we owned, the Neil Diamond record, Coming to America. So I would stand there in front of the mirror and try to sing it. Is it coming to America? Every time unfurling flag, oh, America. But conversely, it took me, I was 14 when I lost most of my Russian accent, and that's a long time. Kids usually lose it way before that. But the fact was that that a lot of my perspective remained Russian. I know kids who came my age, at my age, and they're perfect. They don't think, Russian is just this detail in their life. It's not something they write 4 books about and really care about. They're almost ambivalent about it, whereas I find it impossible to be so. No, look, I love literary fiction. I think it's wonderful. What I was talking about was, in a sense, first of all, the fact that humor is sometimes ghettoized within this, in terms of nobody ever wins an award for a humorous book or an explicitly humorous book, and a lot of the way these things work are award-based. But I teach at an MFA program at Columbia, and I sometimes worry that we're imposing a kind of formula on what a short story or a novel should look like. That it's this serious book that has certain elements, a divorce in Scarsdale followed by, X, Y, and Z. And I'm not against divorces in Scarsdale. I support them. But, a certain thematical, or the historic novel, which begins in 1943 and 1945. And so, again, nothing wrong with any of these things, but what I want is for the art form to keep reinventing itself. And lately, and Lawrence Stein, the editor of the Paris Review, at one point during a Paris Review gala, said something like, yes, we're in the Bronze Age of literature right now, which did not go over well. But there are, everything goes up and down. So I think literature will come back at some point. But right now, there is no doubt among the cultural scene, I think, in America, that this is the golden age of television, oddly enough. The golden age of television series, which use an incredibly novelistic approach. It's a bunch of chapters stacked together. And the ground that they explore is often a lot more interesting. Shows like Transparent, for example, on Amazon, are breaking ground in a way that I rarely see, and with a great sense of humor and satire. And both Little Failure and Supersat are slowly moving toward television series as well. Supersat with Ben Stiller as the director, which should be an interesting combination. But everyone is now interested. There's a greater deal of interest in TV now than in fiction, but fiction survives in a big way because there are much more. Every year there's like 100 new writing programs in America. There's now over 500. So the number of readers is down to about 77,000 in America of literary fiction, mostly in Boston. But the number of literary fiction writers is about 9.5 million, mostly in Williamsburg. So you see the great imbalance. I don't think I was declared funny until I wrote the Genora, the version of the Torah in Hebrew school, where Exodus became Sexodus, and the matriarch wasn't Sarah but Brooke Shieldowitz. We all adored at that point, beyond adored. So that's when I think people just said, oh, he's funny. This crazy Russian guy is funny. Oh, no, they said he's crazy. He's crazy. But being crazy was better than being Russian. So I said, okay, now I'll move on to that. So I'll go from a non-tolerated loser to a semi-tolerated loser, and that is a huge step in the right direction. And again, humor did that for me, and it could do that for anyone.
I want to leave some time for you to sign some books, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much.